Welcome to the XStore point of service lesson on OpChainConfig.xml. In this session, we're going to learn about how the workflow of the XStore point of service application can be customized through configuration. So OpChainConfig.xml is the core workflow controller file in the XStore app, where you essentially can control everything about how XStore flows and interacts with the user. The XStore application flow is primarily divided into individual units of work that we call operations. These operations, which each are represented by a single Java class, are chained together in ordered sequences that we call operation chains. OpChainConfig.xml is the XStore config file where all these opchains are defined. So if we look at a sample opchain called print receipts, that operation chain has several elements within it. So you see a build receipts operation, a print receipts operation, some workers that email receipts and save receipts off, and some various other functionality contained in there. If we flip over to the actual base OpChainConfig.xml file, here again at the top of that file, we see that print receipts opchain right here. And if we look through this file, it's actually pretty huge. There are in all, looks like a little over 10,000 lines in this file, so it's pretty massive, but all it is a list of chains. Everything in here is an operation chain, and every operation chain is a list of operations that are ordered. Some of these operations have additional attributes on them that help you control the workflow or control exactly how you want the operation to behave. So you'll see things like breakpoint equals true, which indicates that if you're traversing through an opchain and need to back up, it's sort of a stopping point when you're going backwards. A validations being attribute, which can be used to declare the input validation rules that need to run when data is collected from that operation. And you'll also see a lot of these opchain route elements, which essentially allow you to route off to different chains from the chain that you were running. So depending upon how you run these other chains, the opchain routes can be conditional, or they can be configured to either pass control back to the calling chain once the new chain is completed, or you can just pass off unconditionally and never return control to the calling chain. So there's quite a bit that you can do from a workflow standpoint using this file. Operation chains are joined into the actual application UI using files like menu config and action config. So if you think about the function key menu at the bottom of the screen in XStore, each of those menu options is tied to an action configured in ActionConfig.xml, and most actions in ActionConfig.xml are linked to an operation chain key, which links into this file. So that indicates that when you press the button that represents that action, that tells you what operation chain in XStore is going to run. So moving on to the next slide, OpChainConfig.xml contains a list of chains, as we already saw. Each element in the chain describes an individual workflow unit. Calls to other chains can be stacked, which is what we call the type of control that we pass off that will ultimately return control back to the calling chain, or started such that flow control is passed off permanently. Again, if we look over at the OpChainConfig file and we look at some opchain routes, and maybe we'll do a quick find for those. Opchain route. And I flip through some of these. Generally, the default behavior for any opchain route is going to be a stack, which is basically just means it's sort of an include statement. It's like if you can picture taking the contents of the opchain key that's being called and just sticking it in the point that the opchain route exists. You have some more complex things you can do here. For example, here we have, within this opchain route, we have a choice where there are 3 possible chains that could be run based on the evaluation results of these condition classes that are configured here. So in this case, the opchain processor, which is sort of the governing engine behind the opchain config, is going to reflectively instantiate these condition classes that are going to have an evaluation method that returns a Boolean. And it's going to figure out, based on evaluating these conditions, which of these 3 opchains should run. So it's sort of like saying, if this exchange transaction total less than 0 condition is true, then you want to run this chain. Otherwise, if the is total greater than configured amount chain condition evaluates to true, then you run this chain. Otherwise, if neither of those conditions are true, then go ahead and run this final chain to the left, which is display regular return message. So this is an example of a more complex opchain route but you'll see these OpChain routes sort of pasted throughout the OpChainConfig file. Here's an example of an OpChain route with a chain type equals start. This is the behavior where when you see this chain type equals start, this chain is going to be run and then control will never be passed back to this calling chain. Instead, the OpChain processor will be allowed to decide what the application needs to do after this new chain is run. Again, the other behavior would be if I configured this to be stack, then control would be passed back to this calling chain after the verified return chain is run. You'll never actually see this chain type equals stack written in the OpChainConfig file because stack is the default behavior. So there's really no reason to ever declare that as an attribute. The only time that you'll see the attribute actually declared is when the chain type is start. So as we saw, chains can be run conditionally using configurable run conditions, or they can be invoked programmatically from within your operation classes. So as stated earlier, every actual XStore operation is backed by a Java class that extends from a common abstract parent in the XStore framework. So when you implement these operations or extend the base operations, you have the ability to tell the OpChain processor from your code what you want the OpChain processor to do next. The default behavior, if you just tell the OpChain processor that your operation is complete, would be just to move on to the next operation in the chain. But you could alternately do things like tell the OpChain processor based on some conditional logic to go run some other chain. There's a lot of ability and flexibility that you have as a developer, not only through configuration of the OpChainConfig.xml file, but also when you're coding your own operation classes. So the last point on this slide is that OpChainConfig.xml strives to make the application workflow as transparent as possible to developers. This is something that we really try to hang our hats on in XStore. When you're looking at the OpChainConfig.xml file, we want to make it as easy as possible for you to be looking at that file and understand what the application is going to do and in what order. Now, you may have to jump around in that file when you see an OpChain route and look up the definition of that chain that's being routed to understand what's going on, but it still allows you to see a lot of what the application workflow is going to look like without actually having to look at the code. So another thing that we do in the OpChainConfig.xml file in the base application to help make it easier for developers extending XStore is we provide a lot of these base hooks within our base opchains. So if I were to look at the pre-tendering opchain, so this is the chain that gets run whenever the user is done entering items and clicks the add tenders button or clicks enter at the item scan prompt so the system transitions into tendering mode. It runs a series of checks to make sure that the transaction is ready to be tendered. It potentially will, for example, nag you if your encryption is not up to date before you start tendering with credit cards, things along those lines. But we also have some of these OpChain routes that we include here, pretendering.1, pretendering.2, pretendering.3. These actually serve as hooks for the developer in the extension layer. So if we look at the definitions of these chains right here, they're actually empty. This is not an uncommon thing to see in XStore. We specifically provide these empty hooks so that if you wanted to insert functionality of your own in the middle of this base chain, you could just implement one of these hooks, essentially override this definition of pretendering.1 or pretendering.2 or pretendering.3, add whatever custom operations you want, and that way you don't have to actually override the entire opchain by cutting and pasting or copying and pasting this whole chain into your extension layer. Of course, you can do that if you want, and there are going to be some cases where if you needed to, for example, insert a new operation between two very specific points in a chain, or maybe delete an operation from a base chain or reorder operations in a base chain that you just wanted to modify the behavior, you could easily do that by copying and pasting the chain from the base configuration file into your own file in the customer extension layer. So in the extension layer, you have the ability to override base chains and to add your own custom chains associated with your own custom functionality. The last thing to look at in OpChainConfig is if we want to take a quick look at how chains are bound to menu options in XStore. So if I open up the menuconfig.xml file, which is the primary file that controls how all the function key and context menus appear to the user, this file is just a big list of menus. If I look at the sale menu, which is defined right here on line 591, and I take a look through this, let's see if we can find a good example. So let's look at, it's calling out a couple subchains. Here are a few specific menu options that are being added to the menu. So we have sale, add non-physical, sale, add gift card, sale, add gift certificate. So if we look at sale, add non-physical, this menu option references this specific key, which we're typically going to find declared in the base action config.xml file. Now, actions can be defined in menus, they can be defined in XStore prompt definitions, they can be defined in XStore form definitions, but for the most part, the action definitions themselves live in this action config file. And what you'll typically see associated with any action in this file is a chain key. The chain key in this case is sale non-physical start, and if I key back to my OpChainConfig.xml file and do a search for that, I'll see that there's a chain with that name defined in it. So that essentially means that when I'm navigating my function key menu and I press this option, the sale add non-physical option, now there's going to be a translation key and a more appropriate user-facing string or label associated with that option. But when I press that option, it's going to look up the definition of this action, see that it needs to run this chain. It's going to key into this file, into all the loaded OpChain definitions, and it's going to run this OpChain. And the way it's going to do that is by iterating over every one of the operations or OpChain routes in this chain until it completes it, at which point it's going to ask the engine what it needs to do next. That can be controlled by a variety of factors, but typically if you're already in a specific transactional mode or selling mode, so for example, if you're in the middle of selling items, the user invokes a function key, the OpChain processor runs a chain or series of chains, it'll go right back to that mode that you were previously in that case, the selling mode where you're adding items to a transaction. So that is our lesson on OpChain config for the XStore point of service application. Thank you.